but do keep your cameras on. It's lovely to be able to actually see human beings on the other side of the screen, kind of see your reactions, even frowny faces if things don't quite make sense. Engage on the chat as much as you like. If you're struggling for whatever reason to see the slides, or if you've dialed in from your phone, the slides from today's sessions are already available on the GoLab website. And after this session, we'll send out an email with a recording of the session and with the slides, which reminds me, oh, Tanya, perhaps you've started the recording of the session, so that just so that everyone's aware, we are recording today's session. So if any of your colleagues want to watch it, or if you want to revisit it at a later point, you have that option. So I'll stop there and hand over to Tanya to introduce the first part of our session.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session. My name is Tanya Hamid, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate at the GoLab. My current work is very much around evaluating impact bonds and building evidence around outcome-based commissioning. So really excited to be here today with you and also for the series overall. For the first part of the session, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who's Christine from the IDB Lab. She will be giving us a quick overview of social impact bonds in Latin America and also IDB's work in the region. The IDB Lab is also the commissioner of this report that underpins our session today, and it will be really helpful to have a bit more background on that. So over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Tanya and Andrea, the whole of GoLab. Definitely good morning to some of us on this side of the Atlantic, and good afternoon to some of you on the other side of the Atlantic. Good evening to Tanya and others who are way on the east of all of us. Thank you all for joining us and for staying. I hope you're staying healthy and taking care of these very uncertain times. I'm the lead specialist at the IDB Lab in Colombia, and as such, I am responsible both for the SIB facility and the SIB program in Colombia. Let me first say what an honor and a privilege it is to be presenting the first study on SIBs in Latin America at GoLab's kickoff event of its new Engaging with Evidence series, as Andrea was telling us earlier on. It's so exciting. To many who may not be familiar with the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, it is the regional development bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, and it was founded in 1959 and is the leading source of finance and know-how for developing and improving lives in the region. The IDB Group, you may not know, has 3 different organizations: the bank itself that lends resources and know-how to the public sector, IDB Invest, which is the private sector arm of the group, and IDB Lab, which is where I work, which is the innovation lab for the group that drives innovation for inclusion. And what we're really trying to do is to support new and better ways to make opportunities available to traditionally excluded populations. So as you can see, the SIBs fit so very well in our mandate. In 2014, IDB Lab started the SIB facility after having found in the UK, US, and other developed countries, this innovative financing mechanism that helps focus social spending on outcomes instead of activities, and crowding in the private sector as upfront investors. Now, when I say we, I actually mean Zach Levy, who is here with us today, who pioneered the SIB facility and the SIB projects in the region at the IDB. I inherited the facility when Zach left a few years ago and thought it might be useful to fund a rigorous study of what the facility and the projects that have been doing in the past 6 years. I am actually one of the people that least knows about SIBs, and so therefore having experts like Ecorys to help us understand what this was all about was very, very important. We didn't really have a snapshot of all that we've done, and it certainly wasn't available in a learning document, so that in a nutshell was the objective of this study. James and Alma have just done a tremendous job in very difficult circumstances. They were only able to physically visit Colombia, as they will probably tell you, as the pandemic broke out very soon after their first trip. So all the rest of the interviews were done virtually, and they were able to maintain the great quality and rigor of the study that you've probably already seen. And if you haven't, you will see it soon. It's just outstanding. They also had to evaluate SIBs in Latin America at a very early stage in our region. But I feel that it's an important point at which to have initiated the evaluation, because we hope it will be a starting point for many other studies in the future to continue to gauge the development of SIBs, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but in other regions as well. I'm hearing this tingle of people getting on. I'm guessing there's so many people. This is wonderful. Speaking from my role in the currently leading the SIB facility, I can't tell you exactly what I felt, but it was something between enormous relief and a great sense of accomplishment when I read the first conclusion of the study, which I want to quote to you. It says, and I open the quotes, SIBs are a viable product in Latin America. They are a viable product, and they can provide the benefits seen elsewhere. Just with those two things alone, it gives us sufficient ground to move forward with this innovative mechanism to continue to increase the focus of social programs and policy on paying for results. James and Alma will be presenting their novel framework of key factors in building the ecosystem, depending on the stage at which each country finds itself. The acronym is DREAM, which I find so compelling. They also mentioned the importance of having a group of like-minded and purpose-driven individuals to actually get SIBs launched, executed, and evaluated. I'd like to call them the DREAM team, just to continue with the acronym. And it is probably the key factor that drives all others, a group that, while having very different objectives, and they will, depending on the role they're playing, have a higher purpose of being able to launch, test, and learn from SIBs and hopefully achieve scale. This study has given all actors in the SIB ecosystem in Latin America so much to consider. For those who are interested but wondering if you should be involved and get involved, I'd say absolutely yes. But understanding the benefits and the risks that any innovation, the learning from this document is very real. Innovation is about risk and uncertainty and trying and learning and trying again. If you're looking for a clear way forward with all the evidence guaranteeing that it will work, this is probably not for you. But if you really want to find innovative ways for more effective outcomes, if you understand that it requires a change excuse me, I'm losing my, you still hearing me? I'm losing my
You're breaking up just
visual,
a little bit, Christine, but we can still hear you. Okay, I'm going to try and move and see if it'll work better. I'm going to turn my camera off just to ensure that my voice still sounds. So I was saying it requires a change of mindset and very much of behavior. And it won't be an easy road ahead. But if you find the way, it will have been worth it. Change is never easy. And the panel that follows, which is stellar, as Andrea has already said, can attest to that. This is also not about big numbers. There are people who ask me, why is a SIB so small? It's because it's a minimum viable product and has a demonstration effect. The numbers will come later if the evidence on what works is gathered and rigorously and is shared widely. If the market is able to scale SIBs and outcome funds, and ultimately, if the government is able to mainstream outcome payments into their social spending budget. At a time of social unrest around the world, focusing on being able to show real results in improving social outcomes just seems to make so much sense to me, and I'm sure it does to you as well. At the IDB group, we are taking all of this in and taking it very seriously, and we hope to be able to understand our different roles we've played with our partners, the necessary evolution as we continue to learn. We are very grateful for the study's recommendations and very valuable insights. We know things are changing fast and new things are happening in Chile, which Federico can tell us about, and new work in Mexico with initiatives that have started to be discussed in Haiti, the Southern Cone, particularly Uruguay, Jamaica, Ecuador, and so many others. So a lot of work on the horizon. Someone once said that we can see farther and we can reach further when we stand on the shoulders of great men and women that came before us and opened new ground. Many who have taught us are on this call today. So let me just finish by saying that this publication would not have been possible had it not been, first, for James and Alma, who have been our wonderful authors of the study, and their enormous experience and knowledge on the topic, as well as their creativity, resourcefulness in getting all this work done despite the challenges. Also, our thanks and recognition to the over 80 actors that were interviewed in the 5 countries. Each of you added a patch and a stitch
that helped weave the overall picture of SIBs in the region today. Thanks also to Cesar Buenadicha, Mariel Sabra, Carolina Carrasco, and Yuri Soares from IDB Lab, Zach Levy and Daniel Uribe for reviewing and commenting on the study, the members of the Latin American Pay for Success Network for their feedback at the validation workshop, and a very special thanks to Monica Otsuka at IDB for her tremendous work behind the scenes on the design and translation to Spanish of the study and its publication as an IDB technical note. To Go Lab, especially Mara, Andrea, Tanya, thank you for your constant support and guidance and for helping us to make these results available to others around the world. I hope the learnings and recommendations that are shared today are as valuable to others as they have been to us, and that we continue to see the work of SIBs and outcome contracts in helping to improve the lives of those who most need it. Please enjoy the session. Back to you, Andrea. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Christine, for that really helpful overview and for setting the context for our discussion today.
Sorry, Tanya.
That's all right. That's okay. Building on this, so let's move to the next part of our session, where we'll be discussing the latest evidence from developing social impact bonds in Latin America, particularly from 5 countries, including Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and Brazil. We're very lucky to have the authors of this report with us today, so Alma and James from Ecorys, who will be taking us through the key findings and lessons learned from their research. After this, we'll have about 5 minutes for questions, so please do start dropping in any questions or comments you have into the chat, and I'll come to you very shortly. So over to you, James and Alma.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. So hello, everybody. I'm James Ronicle. I'm an Associate Director at Ecorys, and I lead on our impact bond research. We've been researching and evaluating impact bonds for about 7 years now, starting in the UK, but looking at impact bonds now around about 40 across 4 different continents. So we were very intrigued and honored to be asked by IDB to do this study here, looking at the work of IDB and other stakeholders in Latin America around growing the SIB ecosystem in Latin America. Our study had 3 sort of areas of focus. Here, the bottom one was looking at the SIBs themselves. So what were the SIBs trying to do? How are they operating? And what sort of impacts did they seem to be having on the services that were being funded through a SIB? The second one was looking at the sort of SIB market as an ecosystem. So how do you introduce this mechanism that's been developed in a completely different context? How do you introduce that to a new continent in places that don't necessarily have experience with this mechanism? And the third one is looking at the role of an organization like IDB and how they can assist with trying to grow the SIB market. The area that we're going to focus on specifically for this presentation is that middle band. So we're thinking here around growing this, introducing SIBs to new countries, and how do you do that? How do you support and grow that? And in particular, what can other parts of the world learn from what has taken place in Latin America? In terms of the methodology, this was predominantly primary research. So we reviewed documents, we reviewed strategies developed by IDB and in the local countries as well. And we interviewed key stakeholders across the 5 countries. This is Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. As Christine said, we only physically got to Colombia before lockdown occurred. So that visit took place January 2020, and then the other fieldwork took place remotely over February, March, April 2020. And we interviewed a range of stakeholders involved, including from the government, donor organizations, intermediaries, service providers, and investors, and also other stakeholders as well. I don't have control of the slides, so I'm going to do pauses in the hope that, but I will prompt you to if I need to. Thank you. In terms of the context then, so what, as Christine introduced it, this was an aim from the Inter-American Development Bank to support the growth of social impact bonds across Latin America, starting with these 5 countries and launching a SIB facility that provided a range of different support, including funding, technical support, including offering being an investor if necessary, driving the program in certain countries. And this slide here just gives a broad overview of when we started undertaking our research at the beginning of 2020, so over a sort of 3-year period, what had been achieved, what had occurred. And what we saw is that there were quite different levels of progress in the 5 countries that we were looking at. This slide here just sort of summarizes it. So in Colombia, by this stage, two SIBs had been launched. The government had embedded the concept of the SIB in the national sort of development plan within Colombia, and the Colombian government were paying for and launching an outcomes fund to fund, Christine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about 11 employment-focused SIBs across Colombia. At this stage, Argentina had launched its own SIB, fully paid for by the government, and Chile was in the progress of launching 3. So none of the SIBs in Chile had launched, but they were in development. Brazil had explored launching SIBs twice. Sorry, I thought someone was talking. Brazil had tried to launch SIBs twice, and at both times had not launched them. And Mexico had tried to launch a SIB once and had also not launched it. So we were faced with 5 countries in the same continent receiving support from the same organization at the IDB Lab facility over a similar time frame, but when we came, had reached very different points in their progress of trying to achieve fairly similar aims. So one of the key questions that we were trying to answer and look at is, well, what can explain this? What seem to be the drivers that might lead one country to government to embrace the concept and launch multiple SIBs, and another country to attempt it and not launch any? So what were these underlying factors that seemed to be influencing this? And as Christine introduced, we kind of boiled this down to 5 key factors that when these factors seem to exist, it seemed to support and increase the likelihood that the impact bonds would launch. When these were not there, it seemed that could explain why they were attempted and not launched. And this sort of spells out our sort of the DREAM acronym. So this is demand from government, a regulatory framework that enables impact bonds to be designed and launched, the right economic and political context, the availability of data, and also market capacity as well. So that's investors willing to invest, intermediaries that can support service providers with the capacity to deliver as well. And I'll one more slide from me, and then Alma is going to explain each of these different factors in a bit more detail. I think the other thing that we looked at was it seems to be that you can divide the kind of development of a SIB ecosystem into 3 kind of phases. And what's important and what's necessary, whilst it seems all of those 5 factors are necessary if you do want to embed the SIB mechanism into an ecosystem, different things are important at different stages in your development. So we broke this down into the first one is developing first-time SIBs. So when you first want to introduce this concept into a country and you want to launch, say, 2 or 3 SIBs, there are certain things that are particularly important at this stage, but not necessarily everything is needed at this stage. We saw countries sort of tend to move then into this second phase of once 2 or 3 SIBs are launched to try and sort of establish that mechanism. So try and grow more, expand it into a new area, or do them more efficiently or more cost effectively. And once you get into this phase, moving away from 1 or 2 pilots, the factors that we explained become more necessary until the third phase. Once the SIB mechanism is established, there are then new things that you need to do to kind of grow that and develop it further. I will now hand over to Alma Augusti, Senior Research Manager at Ecorys, who led this study, so really should be talking about it more than I should.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I will be talking you through the nitty-gritty details of the report and explaining a bit what these enabling factors look like across the different countries and what similarities we can draw from the study. So I'll be starting with demand from government. What we found when we were doing this study was that since the SIB facility launched in 2014, demand from government has grown considerably across the different countries, and generally interest for social impact bonds and impact bonds more generally is starting to resonate a bit more, and particularly the benefits that SIBs can bring. So a focus on outcomes and the cost effectiveness of interventions. But we did also see that governments are particularly interested in SIBs as a mechanism for testing, and that it's not considered to be the only tool to do this. So it's seen as one innovative finance solution amongst others. We found that government demand is important from the beginning. So James was telling you a bit about the different phases. We think from what we found, that it's important from the beginning, but not essential. So from the SIBs that launched without government involvement or with less government involvement than in the UK, for example, we found that demonstration effects were very useful in then driving a bit more demand or a bit more interest from government stakeholders as the mechanism got a bit more established. And in terms of the different enabling factors in fostering this government demand or government buy-in, we found that from Colombia, a key lesson for us was that launching SIBs as a program of multiple sequential SIBs can help with this, with the demonstration effects and with building this evidence of the effectiveness of SIBs that SIBs can have. We also found that the inclusion of SIBs or PBR more generally in government plans, as we saw in Colombia or Chile, can be instrumental in enabling this and promoting the interest. We also found that a clear visual and rationale for why to do a SIB as a catalyst for change was essential and very important in developing this buy-in. Working with organizations that have a good relationship with government was also essential. We saw that in all countries. It helps with trust, it helps with interest, and it helps with the working relationship as you're developing and launching the SIBs. And finally, we found that while you're developing government demand or you're working with government in promoting these mechanisms, it's essential to have a SIB champion, so someone who really buys into it and thinks that this is a good way of delivering new services or of innovating. And this champion can sit at different levels. We found that there were advantages and disadvantages to working at the different levels. So working at central government level can be interesting and beneficial in engaging with the Ministry of Finance or of Economy, but also working at state level can really make sure that the social policies or the programs that you're trying to deliver are more linked to the local needs. So there's a lot more detail of this in the report, but I think I'll move on to the next enabler. In terms of the regulatory framework, we'll be covering this in the panel in a lot more detail, so I'll only give you a bit of an introduction, but we did find that the regulatory framework in Latin America is an essential factor, and maybe more so than in other areas, just because it is a very complex framework and not always designed to be very suitable for SIBs. We found quite a few constraints across the countries, and these are often shared. We'll discuss this in a bit more detail later. But we found that, for example, constraints for budget cycles, where budget cycles are annual, was a key constraint to developing multi-year commitments. Also, laws and frameworks enabling payments to be attached to outcomes weren't always present. And investors being able to have, well, legally being able to have a return on investment was also a challenge in some of the countries. So in terms of, previous slide. So in terms of what, when this is important, we did find that, you can launch a first SIB without having all of these regulatory framework elements supporting a SIB ecosystem, but they will become more important as the ecosystem develops and the mechanism becomes more established. What is important is to have sufficient stakeholder commitment and government willingness to be flexible in how to approach these, and international funding can be useful in overcoming some of these barriers. And finally, having high-level counsel, legal counsel, and government champions is also very, very important. Next slide, please. In terms of the economic and political context, so this is it's an interesting contextual factor, because we found that the political context is also quite relevant to the Latin American context in terms of how high staff turnover can be. So this can inhibit the ability to undertake long-term projects, and also pose challenges in how you embed technical expertise. In terms of the economic side of things, when we looked at the SIB in Argentina, we found that high levels of inflation can make it challenging for outcomes to be paid and agree a price for them. So in terms of looking at when this is important, obviously political context and economic context is always important, but in order to establish the SIB mechanism, some of these things become more important as the ecosystem grows. And we found that working within government cycles is key in preventing SIBs from not launching. I think a key challenge, because of government changes and priorities changing, was that sometimes SIBs weren't able to launch when elections happened. When this isn't possible, it's important to engage with the incumbents early on to make sure that you're developing the buy-in from early stages. Again, international stakeholders can add credibility and help overcome some of these issues, especially in the first phases. And finally, if inflation rates are unstable, it's important to link outcome prices to changes in inflation. Next slide, please. So we're second to last enabling factor. We think availability of data is well known to be a key factor in being able to develop SIBs. We found that availability of data varies greatly across the continent and more so across policy areas. So there might be some policy areas where the data availability is better and others where it's pretty much non-existent. What we found is that another additional challenge to the availability of data is the mechanisms for sharing data across government departments and interesting elements of how to overcome this as well. Yes, so availability of data becomes a lot more important as the ecosystem grows, just because you can develop a first SIB with limited data. We know it's very challenging, and this affects the perception of risk and cost of different stakeholders. But we've seen that with little data, it can be done, especially if the data is developed through the SIB. But it becomes critical if you want to establish the ecosystem. And this is because it helps with the design, it helps with pricing, and it helps with the evidence. So in terms of what the key enabling factors in, oh, I see that there is a mistake here, in key enabling factors in data availability is engaging with socially motivated investors who are willing to take risks in the absence of good quality data. We saw this across all SIBs. It's essential, really, when the data isn't available. Also using first-time SIBs as an opportunity to develop the gaps in this data and generate new data that can be used for future SIBs, as we saw in Colombia. And in this sense, a programmatic approach where you launch sequential SIBs that can build on the data of each other is a very good approach. Working with government stakeholders from early on, even if they aren't paying for outcomes, just to know what data is available, what data can be shared, and how it can be strengthened going forward. And finally, when the data isn't available, making sure that you do make an investment in strengthening it and improving it over time. And last but not least, in terms of market capacity, we looked at this in the study from two perspectives. So one is the investor interest and whether the investment offer for SIBs is attractive. We found that overall there is sufficient investment interest if the offer is attractive across the 5 countries. There's a bigger challenge on the service provider side, where we found that capacity does exist to launch SIBs and to develop SIBs, especially in certain policy areas like employment, but that this varies across geographies within the countries, and it also varies across policy areas, and that it might become a challenge as the ecosystem grows if we are to scale SIBs as a mechanism. And some market development activities might be needed to strengthen this capacity. So the market capacity is important in all phases, but will become essential as the mechanism is established. And finally, in terms of the enabling factors for developing market capacity, we need to make sure that SIBs are attractive to investors. Philanthropic investors are likely to be more interested, but they should just be investable in general. And finally, having the access to the right technical expertise and support to design and manage SIBs is key, especially in the early phases where this capacity might not be embedded in government institutions yet, but can be embedded going forward and as it becomes more established. James, I don't know if you want to take over here.
Yes. Have we lost the slides?
I think so.
I'll see them.
Bear with me 1 second, James. You'll have them up on the screen shortly. There you go.
Thank you. I'm actually not going to talk to these next 2 slides. These 2 are really as a way of trying to bring everything together. So if no one has time to read the report, those 2 slides kind of pull everything together that Alma and I have just said. So in terms of our closing remarks, the kind of big questions we were asked to answer in this study is, can you launch a social impact bond in a completely different context, in a middle income country when this was designed in an Anglo-Saxon sort of system? Can you do it? Should you do it? And if the answer to those 2 questions is yes, how do you go about doing it? I think what we found is, can you do it? Yes, you can. I mean, we saw, as we said, 2 launch in Colombia and then an outcomes fund being done, 1 being launched in Argentina and developments being done in Chile as well. So when Christine quoted us at the beginning as saying this is a viable product, it does look like it's something that can be launched in a middle income context. Having said that, the model does need to be adapted to fit the regulatory, economic and political context within which the country is being used, and Alma provided some of the details around that. Should you launch one in a middle income context? I think it's probably too early to definitively say whether you should or you shouldn't. What we did see though, is we were testing for some of the SIB effects that are often claimed to exist and that we often do see in the UK and other areas around a stronger focus on outcomes, increased transparency, increased accountability. And we did see those in the impact bonds that we saw in Latin America. So some of the claimed benefits that we have seen elsewhere, they did also transfer across as well when introduced into a different context. How do you do it? How do you introduce a SIB to a completely new area? Well, this is where the dream framework that we've developed comes in. And I'd be really interested to hear people from other sides of the world who have also been trying to do this, whether some of these lessons resonate. Our point was that whilst over time, our recommendation is you focus on each of those indicators, because if you do want to introduce impact bonds into a new country, they're the things that do need to be developed. Having said that, they don't all need to be done immediately. You need to start with government demand. If there isn't a demand or an interest in this, it's incredibly difficult to get it off the ground. And you also need to look at market capacity. Do you have service providers that could actually deliver in this way? It also seems that this can be most effective when you take a programmatic approach. So rather than focusing in on launching one SIB, you think about the ecosystem and you think about tackling all of those different areas rather than just trying to get a SIB off the ground. And as I said, we undertake evaluations of impact bonds in other contexts, in other parts of the world. I'm looking at one right now, in fact, in Armenia, and many of the challenges and important factors that we've seen in Latin America, particularly around data, we're seeing exactly the same kinds of things in Armenia as well. So based on what we've seen so far, we think a lot of the lessons that have been learned and we try to capture in Latin America are applicable to other parts of the world. But I'm definitely interested to hear whether people agree or disagree with that. But thank you for listening to what we have to say so far.
Great, thank you so much, both, for such a helpful overview, and congratulations on the publication. Lots of interesting insights there, I think, and lots to unpack. I want to come to our audience now and ask if there were any questions or comments, any reflections. As James said, it would be interesting to hear from other people from other regions of the world, if any of this resonates for them. So you can either raise your hand, pop something into the chat, or simply unmute yourself and go. So looking forward to some questions and comments. And as we wait, I did have one question from my side as well. So we at the Go Lab are always really interested in the incentives that sort of drive stakeholders or governments to develop social impact bonds, and especially as alternatives to other commissioning mechanisms. So what incentives did you see as driving stakeholders in Latin America to develop SIBs? And did you see a huge amount of variation from country to country, or did there seem to be similar incentives?
Alma, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think I can start, and if you want to complement, happy for you to do so. But I think we did find that the incentives were fairly similar. At least it's worth noting, I mean, these are early days, right? And these are early SIBs, so the incentives are similar. It's usually stakeholders who are driven by wanting to try something new, wanting to innovate, but also wanting to increase the focus on outcomes and really making sure that these outcomes are delivered. So philanthropic investors tend to be very aligned with donors, government interests, and intermediaries as well. So in general, I think we found similar incentives. I think this might change as the ecosystem develops further, and there might be a wider range as we see in other countries.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm not seeing any hands raised, but if anyone has any questions, oh, I see one now. So that's, forgive me, I might be mispronouncing your name, but
no,
is it Myra?
Mayra, yes.
Myra, great, please go for it.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask you both to talk a little bit more about the challenges of creating new SIBs in Latin America, and especially in my country. I'm from Brazil, and I was right now I'm here in Oxford studying the Master of Public Policy. But before coming here, I was working in São Paulo's state government, and we were trying to implement one social impact bond on criminal reoffending. It was dedicated especially to teenagers with the Fundação Casa. So we were trying to reduce the criminal reoffending of these teenagers. The project didn't go through yet, so I have some views on the challenges we faced, but I wanted to hear from you with a broader vision of the Latin America as a whole, about the challenges and how to really get the best out of it and get more SIBs actually done in Latin America. Thank you.
Thanks, Myra. And that was the purpose in a way of our framework, was to try and understand what are the key so they are the key enablers, but then the opposite is also true, that we found that when those things didn't exist, that was often when you saw challenges. So the demand from government, for example, if you have a government that is quite interested in this, but isn't necessarily fully committed to paying for the outcomes or sort of engaging with this, because it does take quite a long time, then that can be challenging. Equally, the regulatory framework, is the legal structure in place? Because I know in Brazil, that was a particular challenge, as it was in many of the other countries as well. Can you pay for outcomes that are 2-3 years down the line? Or if you have political instability, so if you're changing either at a local or a national level, governments changing on a regular basis, like these things take quite a long time and quite a lot of engagement. And if you have a sort of level of instability, that can make it really challenging. So it's almost, if you don't have some of those 5 things that we mentioned, that's when it gets really hard. But the critical two, I would say, is certainly the beginning, is the kind of where there's a will, there's a way. If you've got demand and commitment, which is what Christine was describing at the beginning, and you also have a capacity, so providers that have the ability to do this and investors willing to invest, then they're normally the things that can get over the other hurdles that you'll see.
Thanks, James. Tanya, if I can just jump in very quickly, because I've seen we've got a couple of hands up and we've got great questions coming through on the chat. So I'm just wondering whether at this point, I can introduce our guest panelists, because I feel like with some of the questions, it'd be really helpful to get their sort of practical insights and the nuance from the different countries that they work in. So with that in mind, and James and Alma, again, huge thanks for this, such a rich set of findings. For the panel discussion, we really just wanted to bring sort of more practical perspective from the, I suppose, design and implementation of impact bonds in Latin America on the ground. And we're really grateful we managed to put together a panel that brings together some really very unique voices. So we have, alongside Christine, Alma, and James, we have Daniel from Fundación Corona joining us from Colombia, got Federico Diaz from the government of Chile, Maria Laura joining from, well, representing an Argentinian perspective and joining us from London, I believe, Zach as well, and we've got Go Lab's Mara Roldi as well. So welcome to you all. Can I just very briefly ask each one of you to introduce yourselves, just so that everyone gets a bit of a sense as to your background and I guess your expertise around impact bonds, and then we'll maybe just jump straight into some of the questions I saw in the chat. Our thinking was to focus the discussion around 3 of the key dream factors, but I think we can be a bit flexible and see where participants want to go with the discussion. So Danielle, can I quickly come to you, and then Federico, Mara, Maria, and Zach.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you all for the invitation to the Go Lab, to the IDB Lab, and to Ecorys. My name is Daniel Uribe. I'm the Managing Director of Corona Foundation, or Fundación Corona. We have several roles. We are the execution agency of the program of social impact bonds in Colombia. It's the SIBs.co or SIBSCO program. We have been also participating as investors in the first 2 SIBs in Colombia. We are part of the Corona Foundation, of the National Advisory Board on Impact Investing, and also part of the Venture Philanthropy Network Latimpacto. So we are kind of agency builders, and we believe a lot about innovative finance in education to employment. That is one of our topics that we work from the Corona Foundation. So very excited to be here.
Thank you. Federico, can we come to you next? And I know you were dropping in and out, so hopefully you're with us.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, you're on your
phone. All, yeah, sorry. First of all, apologize, but this is the first time that I do a meeting with a phone in Zoom. I'm the former Social Impact Bonds Program Manager at the Policy Division at the Chilean Ministry of Science, and I led the design of 3 social impact bonds at the Chilean government, and the topics related with recidivism, homeless, and youth transition. So more than welcome to answer the question about the SIBs development from the government perspective.
Great, really great to have you on the line, Federico. Mara.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. It's very exciting to be here. I'm the academic director at the GoLab. As Andrea and Tanya said at the beginning, we do research and we do engagement. So we involve the community around issue of innovative tools to improve the delivery of social outcomes. So impact bonds is at the bleeding edge of this innovation. And we aim to bring the evidence, raise the awareness about the evidence, and have various events to disseminate it.
Great, thanks, Mara. Maria Laura, can we come to you next?
Sure, thank you very much, and thank you very much to GoLab for hosting this amazing panel. My name is Maria Laura Tinelli. I work for Ecorys Partners, which is an impact investment intermediary firm. We basically build the vehicles through which investors, governments, multilaterals can invest with impact. I'm also here today representing, together with Daniel, the Latin American Outcome Payment Network, which we've co-created with practitioners along the region in LATAM. And we're market builders first and foremost. So we wear many hats, like Fundación Corona in a way. We're part of the different networks that build the impact investment ecosystem, mainly in South America, with a focus on transferring best practice from more advanced markets such as the UK into the region.
Excellent. And last but not least, Zach. Oh, have we lost?
Got to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Zach Levy from Lavoca. We're an innovative finance advisory firm. And previously, I was working with my former colleague, Christine, on impact bonds in Latin America. And, you know, she doesn't give herself enough credit for all the work she did. But, you know, probably was within the IDB leading that work for many years. And then today continue to do work on innovative finance in Latin America. So hopefully we can provide some insights.
Great, excellent. Great to have you on the panel. Before we take questions from the chat, Mara, can I come to you first? So James already mentioned the sort of, I guess, some of the broader applicability or relevance of some of the findings in the report. Clearly, demand from government or buy-in from government is one of the most important factors. Can I bring you in just to bring some reflections from the work we've been doing at the GoLab, what we've seen as the practice in the UK, and really maybe more of a kind of step back around kind of what do we actually mean by demand from government? What are the incentives for government to be involved?
Thank you, Andrea. I really like this question because the demand from government is actually a term with which I have a big problem. I think there is a dangerous narrative when we talk about demand from government and buy-in from government. The UK experience, if like taught us that government engagement has been very important from the get-go, is something we find in the report. But a barrier when we came to expanding the number of impact bonds in the UK, a major barrier was the government thinking they were being sold something. So they're being sold an instrument. And they didn't see any need for that. So I think it's important to specify what we mean by demand from government, and is the fact the government realized it's worth their while. So to me, the key question is to answer the question the government have is, why bother? It seems it takes more time, it might be a bit complex, I need to work with this new player, and immediately you have a barrier, like, why bother? And we need to come up with a good answer to that question, and if there is no good answer to the question, government will not engage, because they have their usual way of doing things. So it's really important to demonstrate that working with this in this new way is solving a problem they have, and is solving that problem in a way that is better than the instruments they have at hand. So I think having demonstration sites is a great idea. So the work that we see from Latin America, in particular in Colombia, when they started with a simple example, and then they expanded building on the learning. That seems like a fantastic idea. So to me, I'm not against the content. I just think that with the narrative, we need to be a little bit careful in the language. And I try to find with a different way to call it. I call it government engagement, but then you come up with GREAM and the GREAM team. So I understand it's not an appealing acronym, but I think it's important to recognize we are not selling an instrument to government. Government is important from the get-go if we expect them to pay for the outcome once this market is growing. So it's just an adjustment. And I see there is Sharon on the line from the Lottery Fund, and maybe she can share a perspective later on the experience we had in the UK when projects were led by provider with government coming on board much later compared to when government was on board from the start.
Great, excellent. So we might come on to Sharon in a minute. Sharon, I don't want to put you on the spot though, and also feel free to just share reflections directly on the chat. But okay, to this question, why bother? Maybe I can bring in Danielle to share some of the experience in Colombia, and maybe Federico as well to just maybe say a few words about why the Chilean government is interested in SIB. So, but first over to Danielle.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Well, I think in Colombia, we saw that one of the biggest issues here in Colombia is inequality, and employment is one of the highest or more effective ways to improve social mobility. According to the government, we start working with the Social Prosperity Department that actually is working on poverty alleviation kind of issues. And they saw the social impact bonds, and in particular, inclusive employment for vulnerable population as a new way of thinking. This start passing because we have, as you mentioned at the beginning, the program SIBSCO. And I think it's important to mention a little bit about the program and why it also helped to make everything happen from the government. Because we previously tried to develop a SIB that didn't go through. But in this moment, we also build SIBSCO is a program that has resources from the Swiss government, from the Secretary of State of Economic Affairs, and the IDB, and it leverage the interest on the government, de-risk a little bit as co-payers. Within the study you mentioned as a hybrid methodology, but that helps the government to see, okay, this is something new. We haven't tried, we're not looking for it, but we can try develop innovations in our problem. And our problem was employment, and employment as a way to improve poverty, decrease poverty, so poverty alleviation. So the government starts saying, okay, what we need is to have good partners. It's a champion thing, so we have to have teams. And the first element that got the attention from the government was the innovation, not the employment part. They say, okay, this is a new way of solving our problems. And these kind of persons that see this ADN have the possibility to take some risk in this demonstration effect. Today, 5 years after the program started, we have seen that this demonstration effect has actually moved the needle, from betting 5 years ago in the first SIB on an emerging country to today have within the Social Prosperity Department an outcomes fund. And an outcomes fund because the government already sees that this is not about SIBs building. It's about changing the mindset in how we can actually have a much better approach towards outcomes than outputs. And that's the end goal. Within the outcomes fund, the government itself has already used for their own programs an outcome-based program, not a SIB itself. So the government start evolving from the demonstration effect to actually see how this can provide better tools to address these kind of situations. I will stop there for the time.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And I'll go to Federico in a moment, but I just saw a question on the chat around sort of like specific challenges around setup and transaction costs, and whether taking a programmatic approach can help alleviate some of those challenges. Is that part of the rationale for using an outcome fund in Colombia?
It is part, because in some cases the outcomes fund still have some resources to address those issues, to have a bigger challenge with more transactions, but also has the program approach from the beginning. SIBSCO supported resources with the IDB and SECO resources to fund design. Design is expensive at the beginning stages. Set up the 6 months till 1 year kind of design process takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of time. So to be able to support that process, it's very, very relevant. Outcome sum is one way, but the programmatic approach we also try and develop here in Colombia has also supported into that particular question.
Great, thanks for that. Federico, can we come to you now for some insights from the experience in Chile, and perhaps some reflections as well around kind of like navigating the political factors, electoral cycles, and so on?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Andrea. First of all, as Colombia, we have a lot of social problems to solve. So at the beginning of the 2018, the President Piñera government creates a board with different public and private stakeholders to define what kind of problems do we have and which one are the most important and relevant to solve in a medium short term. For that reason, and after that boards, which call Compromiso País or country commitment, we started to research about social impact bonds, and also it was part of the political agenda of President Piñera before the elections. So our main idea was to develop these social impact bonds as a new kind of approach based on results in order to use better use of resources and policy effectiveness, but also to supply the lack of evidence-based policies and innovation in Chilean policies. For that reason, we started in 2018 to develop 3 social impact bonds. So it has been really challenging, as you say, mostly because, as most of you know, Latin American countries has a little bit of difficult to pay by results and to manage the budgeting in multi-annual structural terms. For that reason, it is important, as Andrea said, that it's important to have relationship with the key stakeholders from the government, but also from outside the government. One of the main reasons for that is because the personal turnover and electoral cycles in government could terribly affect the design of the social impact bonds. For instance, our project was strongly affected by personal turnover because each time that we work with a certain organization, at the end, the main leader of this organization went to another organization. So we suffer a little bit of difficulties to engage with political leaders. So at the end, we have a strong technical commitment, but not the political commitment that is needed. So that's why it's important to engage political actors, but also all the stakeholders in order to make a little bit of pressure to the government to launch these social impact bonds.
Great, thank you, Federico. And so you've mentioned the other stakeholders that the government needs to work with when we're talking about developing impact bonds, which kind of gives me a nice segue into my next question, which I'd like to address to Maria Laura, which is around the role of all these other stakeholders in the so-called impact bonds ecosystem, both in terms of working with government, getting or consolidating that demand from government, but I guess more broadly in driving forward the development and outcomes-based approaches. And I see a question in the chat specifically around engaging with private investors. So Maria Laura, if we can come to you from reflections, both in terms of engagement with government, but engagement with the wider stakeholder market.
Thank you, Andrea. And in terms of that's the job of an intermediary, engaging with government and engaging also with the other stakeholders that you need around the table to launch a SIB and to then see it to fruition. I agree with the perspective of Mara when she was saying it's not just government sort of buy-in. You need them to want the SIB, because if they feel that you're selling something and that something is not going to be able to demonstrate sort of results in the shorter run, you need to think that in Latin America, as in many other parts of the world, government have very short cycles. So they have 4 years, but they actually have 2 years, because the first year they've inherited whatever from the previous administration, and the last year is election year. So they have 2 years to take a picture. So if whatever you're proposing has a longer term process in order to deliver results, and in order for those results to be visible, and in order for them to use whatever is coming out of the process, then you have a bit of a problem of engaging the government and bringing it to the table. In terms of what has worked for us, at least in not only the City of Buenos Aires SIB, which is the one that we're currently implementing and that we've developed together with social finance and other key players and with the IDB in the City of Buenos Aires, but also others that we have tried and they failed to launch in education in the province of Salta, for example. One of the things that clicks for the government is this opportunity of making a more efficient use of very limited resources they have for that particular issue. The way that works in their heads, at least when you talk to either the economic minister or the procurement secretary or the person in charge of the budget for that particular ministry or secretary within the government, is that they can delay payment. So they have a limited budget. They might have a little bit more budget for the issue in a couple of years' time. And because results take time in order to be achieved and at the point where they will have to pay, this delayment of payment is something that seems to be interesting for government. So they see an efficiency there in that they're only paying for what works and that they're not paying right now when they're maybe in the middle of a pandemic, or maybe they're facing an economic scenario that is not very favorable. The thing that clicks on the reverse of that for the private sector, so for investors, it's how do they help the government to become more efficient, not only in the use of very limited resources, but also in the way that they design public policy to achieve results. So because the first investors that go into a SIB or an outcome fund are usually socially motivated, and many of those are migrating from traditional philanthropy towards investing for the first time with, it's almost venture philanthropy, but investing with impact for the first time. For them, one of the underlying objectives and sort of motivations for getting into a product such as this one, as opposed to other investments that they could do with impact in that particular location, is the fact that they're helping that government make better decisions based on evidence, and they're helping that government become more efficient. So, and we're seeing it with the Argentine SIB, you can be achieving all the different metrics that you set off to achieve in terms of results, but if you're not achieving the underlying objective of we need to help the government become better at achieving results and being more efficient, in a way it's for them it's a loss. They don't see that the full objective has been achieved. And this motivation, if you talk to investors in Chile, which originally were the foundations, and if you talk to investors in other locations, it's usually the same thing. They're willing to invest at risk in order to help the government become more efficient. So this idea of efficiency, this idea of delaying payment when you're very budget constrained are two things that motivate government. The third thing I would say is, and I agree with what Alma and James were mentioning, that came out very clearly in the study. Within the government, you need a champion. You need a Federico, like Federico in Chile, and you need like an Adolfo Díaz Valdés in the city of Buenos Aires. Without that champion, you, even if in whatever the government is saying, they're saying all the right things that you think you can work with them on an outcome payments. If you don't have a champion, you will not get very far, because it is a champion who will navigate all the different layers of decision makers internally for you to get there. If you don't have a champion, you're not going to go very far in the process of getting buy-in and getting all the approvals that you need in the different processes that you set in motion when you set a SIB in motion.
Great. That's really fascinating, Maria Laura. Thank you so much. Just perhaps a final question from me on this point around working with multiple stakeholders, building on something that Zach just posted on the chat around the fact that in Colombia, all the key stakeholders got together around the table from day one. So Zach, what's different in Colombia that was perhaps missing in other of the places that are discussed in the report? What was unique, or what were the secret ingredients?
I mean, I think you have to unpack Colombia on multiple levels. So I think the first is, at least in our work with SIBs, Colombia was kind of the evolution of our thinking as the IDB. And so we initially started off with really trying to really just focus on, let's build up some really good cases and good projects will get funding and get outcomes funding. And what we realized was that wasn't the case. And so then we started doing a lot of work on raising awareness with government, getting government engaged. And that got us to a point. But the reality was that for government and for all these stakeholders, impact bonds were an interesting tool, but small. Even if legal frameworks permitted it, sometimes they were unclear. And there was a real need to build skills. And so the big challenge was, how do you do something that's new while also kind of doing it in a way that's kind of fits within this bigger issue? Because governments do change policies all the time, but they do it for big things, not for small things. And so the interesting piece with Colombia was one, there was a number of actors, particularly Corona and Stiglio on the ground, that were doing a little bit of work beforehand and kind of raising awareness. And two, we had the Swiss government and the IDB, which were kind of framework institutions that could really bring both the government to the table with this longer term view and kind of, we call it the halo effect of these institutions, along with three big foundations who were not just foundations, but also in Colombia, very influential. And so having those stakeholders at the table from the get-go and kind of moving forward from the get-go was a key part of that. And so the more, I think with SIBs, the sad reality is for those first projects is it's not really the best projects that happen. It's usually there's somebody or somebody's that will it forward. And so the more you have those elements under your control and framework institutions that want to push it and the key stakeholders, it then allows it to happen. And I think the key part of Colombia was both those stakeholders, but also the ability through the participation of IDB and SECO through the program to take this longer term view. So you're gonna do something that's complex, expensive, but it's actually programmatic. And so we're gonna test it and we're gonna do a minimum viable product. We're not gonna have to change the legal framework to get around the multi-year contracting. We're just gonna test the relationships. But we're gonna do that within a framework of this is where we're gonna start, but this is where we wanna go. And I think for both the investments and also the government and ecosystem stakeholders, that programmatic vision, I think, greases the wheels a bit. But I think the one caveat though is to not make a mistake that Latin America speaks Spanish, but they're very different countries, and not to always think they're the same.
Precisely. So that's if I may ask just a follow-up question on that. How much did you see any scope to then use the experience in Colombia as a blueprint for engaging other governments in other Latin American countries? Or is it much more about kind of figuring out on a kind of country by country or region by region basis kind of what the best approach might be?
I don't like cookie cutters, and so I'll balk at that. I think there's elements of Colombia that you want to replicate, and probably learnings in I defer to Daniel and Christine as well. But sometimes things that you can't replicate. And I think in Colombia, you had certain types of actors that were at the table that were quite influential and sophistication among them. In other countries, you may not have that, and you need to find other ways and different profiles of framework institutions to do that. And I think for me, the big takeaway is the programmatic, on one hand, and two, to provide that proof of impact with as many elements as you can under your own control, so that you can will that proof of impact pilot forward. That may not be the perfect transaction, but if it's within a bigger vision of what we're trying to build, it becomes much more palatable and kind of keeps people tied to that vision. But I don't know, I'd be curious what Daniel and Christine also think on that.
I agree totally with you, Zach. And I think one of the biggest elements was this sense of the first SIB being an MVP, first evidence to the second SIB at the local level. And actually it was when we have the transition between government and our president changed, and it was the moment where they decided to include the social impact bonds and the outcomes fund as an idea of a public innovation tool. That started to be a game changer, because when you have much more support from the institutionality perspective, from the national level that also influence the local level, start growing the interest so far. So in Colombia, even though we still in a very early stage of 2 SIBs and an outcomes fund developing the first challenge, you start seeing a growing demand from local majors, from different stakeholders, because there is already the change of mindset and new ways of building it. So, but totally agree with you. I don't know what Christine would like to complement.
Maria Laura has her hand up.
Yeah, just to complement what Zach and Daniel were saying, and I fully agree with what Zach is mentioning, is that it's very difficult to do a cookie cutter approach in LATAM because context and so are so different. And what to me it's strikingly different between the Colombian model, which is what we all aim for in LATAM. It's like that's a very good example of best practice in terms of you start small and you start growing and you create this long-term vision. Is the fact that the outcome payers that were sat at the table and that helped the government achieve this sort of longer term vision were not necessarily there if the sole outcome payer was the government. So they retain full decision power over what they want out of the SIB or out of the series of SIBs in the case of Chile, and maybe Federico can comment on that. So it's quite a different leverage that this different stakeholders that are sat around the table have, whether the outcome payer is solely the government or whether the outcome payer is a mix between very influential foundations, very influential multilaterals, and very influential bilateral cooperation. The conversation is substantially different. Hence, what you can and cannot achieve, or what you can and cannot aspire to, even though you know what the best practice would indicate, is very different.
Thanks, Maria Laura. I don't know whether any of the other panelists want to jump in on this point around working with government, but also other stakeholders. Otherwise, I'm quite keen, we don't have too much time left together, and I'm quite keen that I move on
Andrea?
Discussion to the regulatory framework. Yes, Federico?
Yeah, I would like to complement. It's very complicated to talk in the telephone, so I cannot raise my hand. Yeah, I agree with Zach, Daniel, and Maria Laura, but also it's important to us in Latin America, talking from the Chilean perspective, the stories of success. When Argentina and Colombia have a lot of success developing the social impact bonds, for Chile as well is a success because it's easier to us to explain the model to the political leaders. So even though it's different context, Colombia has a huge ecosystem comparing with Chile. For us, at least it's a final way to go. So we try to replicate some things, other things to try to adapt to the Chilean context. But at least the story of success of Colombia and Argentina is a final way to go to the final outcome that we want.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think just to tag on to that, I mean, I think what was interesting is what we heard up until the Colombia point, SIB transactional launch, was that this is a UK-US model. This doesn't apply here. And I think, the ability of Argentina and Colombia to kind of shatter some of those, I guess, conceptions really, I think, probably opened a lot of doors and showed that you can adapt this to the specific country context, which it sounds like Federico was saying was helpful for Chile.
Yeah, great. I'm really keen that we spend some time looking at some of the regulatory frameworks, not least because so a couple of questions on the chat about that. And Maria Laura, can I come to you for maybe an overview of kind of what the state of play is for those of us maybe not very familiar with the relevant legal frameworks across different Latin American countries. And I know the PBR network in Latin America, they've recently commissioned a study that looks specifically at this issue. So I don't know whether there's much you can share with us from that study.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to share a little bit of what will come out in the study, and as soon as it's out, we'll share with all of you. Basically, the regulatory barriers or framework will apply differently on whether you have an outcome payer that is 100% government, or an outcome payer or a group of outcome payers that are coming from the private sector, or a mix between multilaterals, private sector, and government. So you have different levels of constraints or no constraints at all if it's an agreement between private funders. So I'm going to focus my remarks on when you're looking to have a 100% government outcome payer. So if you're looking to have the government as the outcome payer, we see certain similarities across the board in LATAM, and we see certain restrictions in terms of what you can and what you cannot do. For starters, there's no specific regulation in any country yet on outcome payments. There's no regulation, not for good nor for bad. There's no specific regulation on outcome payments, on SIBs in our countries yet. And there's no specific restrictions. But there are restrictions that apply to how a government can procure or not procure. And that's when it becomes a little bit more complex. So basically, a government can pay for outcomes, and they can, though you have to explain it several times and you have to nail it when you have these conversations with the budget holder, whether it is the Ministry of Finance or whether it is whomever is in charge of the budget for that particular ministry, in terms of making them understand that it's a multi-year budget that they're holding and that they're probably likely to deploy that capital in a few years' time or in 2 years' time. And that if they don't use the whole funding that was allocated to that budget, that doesn't mean that it has been under procured. It means that you actually paid for only what was successful. So once you remove that conversation and once you achieve buy-in from the budget holder very early on in the conversations, and this is one of the key conversations to have, then there's no specific restriction. So our government can pay for outcomes, and so long as the budget holder understands this nuance and doesn't penalize that particular ministry for not using the whole budget, then that's fine. The thing that you have to look out for is that there are strict procurement policies in each of the countries that you look at in LATAM. So there are mainly two ways that a government can contract, and it doesn't matter which country you look at. These are, you can say that there's two kinds of contracts. One is you do a direct procurement, and the other one is you do a public procurement. So you do a public bid, and several offerers will submit their bid. The problem with a direct procurement, which is what ideally should happen in nascent markets, such as, I don't know, Chile, Argentina, even Colombia, is that Colombia is a bad example, but the other countries, with the exception of Colombia, is that you don't have a market yet. So if you, as a government, go with a public bid, the problem is with a public bid, you go out as a government with a public bid, but there's not enough organizations that are going to submit an offer. So you end up with a sort of covered direct procurement, which is something that governments try to avoid because of the political exposure it represents for them. In order for a government to justify a direct hiring of a particular specialist, they need to be able to prove that nobody else could provide that particular service or that particular contract. So though they have two options, either they go directly or they go through a public procurement, they end up using the public procurement, or that's what they did in the case of Argentina, for example, and how it was sort of structured in the other countries, even if it didn't launch. But you're not necessarily, it's not a very transparent public procurement process, if you like, because there are not many offers out there. In some contexts where you have PPP, so public-private partnerships as law or as regulation, you could potentially use that as a base, but it's not necessarily applicable in LATAM for outcome payment contracts. So although it has been used in the UK as a base, and though we have looked at it, for example, in the case of Argentina, it doesn't apply or it doesn't transfer 100%. The other side of the things that you need to look at in terms of regulation is fiscal incentives or disincentives, I would say. There are not many fiscal incentives for investors to invest with impact as a whole. It doesn't matter if it's a SIB or if it's another impact investment, not yet in Latin America. But you have, for example, in the case of Colombia or in the case of Chile, foundations investing or paying for outcomes in the different SIBs that are launched or were in the plan for being launched. But that's not the case across the board in LATAM. In some countries, a foundation, which would be the most natural first mover and shaker in terms of investor for a SIB, is forbidden to invest by the fiscal authorities, because if they do so, they lose their tax exemption. So that's a bit of a mixed bag in LATAM. You need to look case by case, but there are no fiscal incentives as a whole. And the other thing is, when a government procures through a public bid, then because governments are tax exempt, and if you on the other side have investors and the government is tax exempt, they don't have any way of deducting VAT, for example, from or income gains tax from whatever they're investing in a SIB, and that creates a disincentive. So not only do we don't have incentives yet in LATAM, but we also have disincentives for some of the investors that are coming into the game. This is likely to change as more SIBs come to bear fruition and as more outcome contracts are launched. But the state of play right now is that you have two ways of procuring, and one, it's not forbidden, but it's complex to implement in nature because of government procurement policies as a whole.
That's very helpful, Maria Laura, and please do share with us the link to the report when it's published.
As soon as
so we've got about 10 minutes, and I just sort of like briefly want to get the panelists' views on the kind of activities kind of linked to developing the ecosystem. That's obviously something that's discussed in quite some detail in the reports. And James, I don't know whether there's anything you want to kind of add on this point. You know, what do we mean by developing the ecosystem? And then perhaps Zach and others, if they want to add sort of detail around what that means in practice, and then kind of how do these activities need to change as you're looking to grow the market for impact bonds in a particular country. James, Veronica, is there anything on your side that you want to add? Obviously, you've discussed some of it in your presentation.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've covered a lot of the stuff that we found in the report, so I'll hand over to other people. I guess in the sort of summary slide that we gave, we were saying there are kind of 4 key principles I think you should take when trying to do this, which is one around capturing and sharing the learning as quickly as you can. So sort of learning what's going on, as we're hearing here with the studies like Maria and our own. So sort of building and sharing those learning. The collective leadership, I think, is really crucial. So we've heard about the sort of SIBSCO and others around having everybody involved in the table around doing this program approach, rather than just focusing on like one SIB, and also a kind of clear rationale and exit strategy. So why are you actually doing this, and where are you trying to go? Are you trying to launch 100 SIBs? Do you see a SIB as a way of getting a more focus on outcomes in government that then is scaled up through more mainstream ways? So what are you actually trying to do? I think that's what we found when this ecosystem approach is most effective. That's kind of the things that are focused on.
Great, thanks James. So Zach, maybe can we come to you for maybe some examples of what's been really effective or successful in Latin America, and then Mara, I'd like to bring you in as well for some reflections on this point. But first, over to you, Zach.
Sure. I mean, so at least with our approach with Latin America, I think there's a lot of trial and error, and what we thought was an ecosystem building project started to evolve into a wider, how do we make this real and start to build the demonstrations. And I think of the ecosystem, and there's a lot of different viewpoints on this, but I tend to want to break it up really into the supply of impact and demand for impact. And so on the supply side, you have advisors, or sometimes called intermediaries, you have researchers and universities, you have investors, you have kind of market builders, like I would say Corona is like that, IDB is like that. And then on the demand for impact, you have governments and you have foundations and bilats. And I think what we saw was that at the end of the day, the big bottleneck was the demand for impact, or maybe not demand for impact, but organizations willing to pay based on outcomes. Because if you could actually push the volume of funding into that type of contract, everything else would take care of itself. It's a market, because then there's contracts. But the challenge was, these are first of projects. And so we really tried to see where the IDB could play that role. And I think IDB, World Bank, institutions that have that, both the funding, but also the long-standing dialogue with government are key parts of that, because it's easy for the private sector to say, oh, you should focus on this project. But sometimes that's good. Other times they don't have that same accountability and same social contract with their citizens that governments do. And and multilaterals as their partners. And so what we tried to prioritize was building in concrete projects towards the end, along with whatever was needed to facilitate that initial supply, building provider capacity, supporting advisors or knowledge transfer to local consultants, engaging local researchers, engaging local investors in that ecosystem. But I think one piece when we think about this that we didn't do, which was when we think about that wider volume of outcome funding, one piece is government, but there's also a whole bunch of resources coming from foundations, bilateral agencies like USAID, multilaterals. And so how do you also in tandem work with those types of organizations, which are doing grants, to also start to move their resources towards outcomes? And it doesn't necessarily have to be mixed with government funding, but the more organizations that are providing resources and their resources based on outcomes, the more learning you have on best practice, the more demand you have on the supply side, which will reduce costs and actually encourage new market entrants, so that people like us or Maria Laura aren't out there, doing yeoman's work and not getting paid, right? As well as, those like in Stiglio, social finance and et cetera. And so I think when we think about our approach as the bank, kind of the big focus was how do you facilitate that supply, but also really focus on your primary objective was that kind of initial nudge with demand and doing whatever it takes. And I think it's a first step. And I think the programmatic approach is good, but I think the next step for the IDB and actors in the region is how do you start to draw on these other sources of funding for social services and getting those organizations, some of which are on the phone call, to also start to test maybe in a coordinated way, results-based contracting, which will, I think, really start to move a bigger conversation forward. So I'll pause at that.
Zach, that's really interesting. And it sounds like you're talking more about or thinking about developing an ecosystem for outcomes or paying for outcomes rather than thinking about an ecosystem for social impact bonds specifically.
And I think that's, everybody has a different opinion on this. We took the program initially focusing on social impact bonds because it was, people could get their head around it. But I think this conversation, and I imagine many of you would agree that it's about outcomes-based financing and it's about innovative finance. And there's a spectrum of strategies around outcomes-based financing, some of which work with social enterprise, some of which work directly with government and don't do pre-financing. And I think it's sometimes helpful to think of it along that spectrum and not necessarily silo it off. And I think it's sometimes it's not a helpful conversation for any of us. And I think if we can think about really what we're trying to do, then we can start to innovate and transition.
Great, thanks.
And I'm getting some positive comments on the chat. So
great, excellent.
That seems to resonate with everybody.
That's brilliant. And obviously we're not going to have time. We've got about 2 minutes together. Mara, I'm really keen to bring you back into the conversation. You've kind of opened the panel for us. So it feels only fair to leave the sort of like any concluding thoughts, maybe specifically around this point around developing the ecosystem, anything in particular that, we need to sort of like be cautious or be careful about as we talk about developing an ecosystem for outcomes-based approaches. And then before we say goodbye to our participants, I would like to ask each of the panelists, including James and Alma, to perhaps share sort of their, one key takeaway. If our participants are to, remember one thing from this discussion, one key recommendation perhaps from the report, what would that be? So over to Mara first, and then I'll just invite each of the panelists for their 30-second key takeaway.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think this report adds a lot in terms of reflection and looking at the big picture and try to draw some lessons learned. The only thing I would like to add is that as I was reading it, I kept thinking how important it is to set the right expectation. So when you engage with the various stakeholders around an ecosystem, and I think there are 3 things that we need to set the right expectation about. One is that these instruments are not a magic bullet, but the status quo is not working or is not working well. So it might not be perfect, but usually these innovative instruments are used where the status quo is problematic. And 2, we need to be honest that we are learning by doing, because it requires local adaptation and there are different contexts. And so we can't just copy and paste. And then finally, I think as I agree with Zach, that this is not just about impact bonds, it's about focusing on outcomes and bringing different partners around the table. And I think it's important to remember, this is not creating the fairy tale wedding where, you know, you sign a contract and then they live happily ever after. This is a real marriage of different stakeholders. You sign a contract and the fund starts there. And there will be ups and downs that you need to prepare to. And I think if you set the expectation that this is not a magic contract, but is an interesting way to work together towards something exciting in the long term, they're more likely to succeed.
Excellent, thanks, Mara. Just conscious, Zach, you made an excellent point. We haven't heard from Christine in a while. Christine, maybe we can come to you then for some key takeaways, concluding remarks. We're just the time, but if people are happy to stay on the line for another minute or two.
Thank you. Thanks, Zach. The idea originally was really that I would just do the intro part as the SIB facility and not get involved in the local SIB, because we have an extraordinary panel that's doing that. And my knowledge of this has really only been in Colombia. So Daniel has done an extraordinary job of actually saying a lot of what we've done in Colombia, and so has obviously everybody else. From a takeaway, let me just suggest when you talk, I'd just like to bring two things to the table. The first is talking about innovation is very different from many other things. And I think that sometimes we move away from innovation. And innovation is that which starts with something you're not really sure is going to work. And you actually have to bring everybody together to see how it's going to work. So if you don't bring the wording, the principles, and the spirit of innovation to social impact bonds or outcome funding, that's when you're going to run into trouble, because many of the times what is being done in government and outside of government, in the civil society as a whole, is very much status quo. And change is not an easy thing to do. So if you don't bring this in as innovation with innovation experts and change experts, you're going to run into problems. The second thing I would like to just kind of leave there, talking to Zach about this, is that while I agree that we're not looking to do 1 million impact bonds, but there's SIBs in particularly, there is one thing that I bring, that I rescue from all the information of the market, and it is that if you only do outcomes contracting, or if the government only does outcomes contracting, sometimes they're leaving out very good service providers that cannot, they just don't have the financial muscle to be able to join this market. So bringing the investors in to upfront the funding actually, I think, does a really good thing about market building that you can't get without them. Our impact investors have been extraordinary, not just because they look at this as an investment, but because they actually wanted to test this with the whole ecosystem. So even though there has been, return and everything, the real problem has been, or the real spirit has been, let's get something better done for the vulnerable populations. We were all behind that from the beginning. So I think bringing people to the table is certainly important, but you have to have that higher objective I was speaking about earlier. Thank you. Thanks, Zach.
That's a wonderful message to leave us on, Christine. Thank you so much for that. James and Alma, can we come to you next? One key takeaway that you'd like people to remember from the session and from the report itself?
I think is that this mechanism has sparked a lot of interest all over the world, and the question often is, well, but how do you do it? How do you actually go about doing this? And I think my key takeaway is, don't try and reinvent the wheel. I think there's an awful lot of lessons both in Europe but also in Latin America, and I'd really encourage you to go and look at other people who have done this before and what lessons did they learn that you can learn from as well.
Excellent, thank you. Alma, anything else you'd like to add?
No, nothing from me. I think my key takeaway is I'm going to go away and read more into the regulatory framework and the paper that Malala was talking about.
Excellent, great. Daniel?
No, thank you. Well, I would say that for Colombia case, focusing on one particular topic, as employment has actually leveraged all the data gathering, all the different stakeholders, because you don't have the same investor service providers in different topics. So one recommendation for us has been starting with one topic, not only, but then from those learnings, continuing to others has able us to get to the moment we are right now, getting attention from different municipalities in the government towards that particular topic, with a new mindset towards outcomes. So that will be one suggestion for all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Federico?
Hi. My main lesson, I think, is keep it simple. I think it's already a extremely complicated instrument or mechanism, so it's just keep it simple and select a relatively easy topic to develop the ecosystem in parallel.
Great, excellent. Thank you. Maria Laura and then Zach.
Thank you. So for me, the key takeaway or recommendation is two. One is make sure that you find and join forces with the right partners, because if you want it to scale, which is my second recommendation, whatever you build it at scale, because it's expensive to build one just for a pilot. Find the right partners that will go with you all the way and that will be with you and work with you in developing this sort of longer term vision of outcome payment and how to use the learnings that you're extracting. So, and this would be regardless of different government changes along the way. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. Find your right partners and find the partners that will go with you a long way.
Great, excellent. Zach?
Sure. Start small, but think big. Be adaptive, and be determined and keep evolving it. And I think just as a final note, I think there's a number of us on the panel here, but there's a much wider group of different types of stakeholders that have been involved in these types of projects across Latin America. And I think it's an acknowledgement to them, both consultants, researchers, investors, current and former government officials, many of which who really put themselves on the line and their careers sometimes at risk to do something innovative. And I think it's within the impact bonding work, there was both the impact bonds, but also a good amount of bonding across the ecosystem. And so there's a good network of people. And so acknowledgement to all those people.
Excellent. Huge thanks to all the panelists, and also huge thanks to all the participants who've just engaged on the chat. Thanks so much for all the additional resources that you've shared on the chat. So I guess if I were to summarize, I guess my key takeaways, it sounds like clarity of purpose is definitely one of the most important things. Know your why, I guess, regardless of, whether you're in government or an intermediary investor. Work in partnership, easier said than done. And then perhaps, I guess, the most important, especially for us at the Go Lab, kind of learning from others, we certainly see ourselves as having a role to play in facilitating some of that learning. And thank you all for joining us today and learning with us from our guest speakers. And just maybe shameless plug for our next session, which is on the 23rd of February even. You'll find all the details on our website, but really please I hope you'll join me in thanking our excellent panelists for the session this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks
Bye.
to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.